Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, review, approve, modify agendas. Any additions or corrections?
None that I have, no.
If none, we'll move on to public forum delegations. Is there anyone in attendance here wishing to speak? We are going to plan on having more public meetings with more information out there, so that's the good time to ask questions and everything. But if you got something you want to say here tonight, you're more than welcome to. No one wants to speak? Okay, we'll move on to conflict of interest at the closure.
No, none.
Okay, if none there, whoops, we gotta approve the agenda first before I move on. You're supposed to catch me on that. So I
was
need
gonna, but you didn't.
I need a
chance.
motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion by Jared, second by Matt. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. We already did the public forum delegations. Does anyone want to speak this time now that it's official? Okay, if not, no conflict of interest
No.
report. So I turn it over to the co-op architecture presentation. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. We're excited to share with you some master planning updates for the school. My name is Tom Hurlbert. I'll let my colleagues here introduce themselves quickly, and then Becca, I might have just given away the ending there, but Becca's gonna kind of walk us through this year. So,
And I'm Tom Oster with Co-op Architects.
And then Becca Wytosik with Co-op Architecture.
and you've seen most of you have seen our faces here before, but we're excited to give you kind of give an update. Becca, you want to
Yep.
go ahead and take it away and just let me know when to turn slides back in. I'll
Let's
stay
do
on
it.
top.
Click through. We just did introductions. So, is that mouse working? Can you put it down? There you go. So you can click through that.
Done with that slide.
Yep. So I just wanted to start off the meeting by kind of looking at where we've been in this process. A quick brief background. So click next slide. These were kind of the initial priority items that rolled the master plan off. So we were looking at a new bus garage, remodeling locker rooms, remodeling restrooms, assessing the oldest section of the facility, and then looking at table and chair storage. So those are the initial ones, and then click. After we've had some discussions with user groups and looking at a lot of feedback we got from online surveys, a few other items rose to the top. So we were also looking at a new front entrance / security, the old gymnasium, kind of multi-purpose space, staff and admin areas, kitchen and cafeteria, library and learning spaces, and playgrounds throughout this master plan process. So want to kind of, again, show where we last updated the board. So the initial concept that we expanded upon was what you're seeing here on the screen. We explored looking at a new front entrance on the east side, and then really trying to create an east-west axis through the school and clean up some of that circulation space while also addressing some of those initial priority items. And then in the bubbles, you can see some of the visual inspiration that we were looking at for some of those spaces. And move on to the next one. So just from some of the feedback that we've gotten with the leadership group that we've been working with, this is where we are at for the revised concept. We have shifted the front entrance a little bit to realign with kind of that more athletic side entrance, really trying to pull any of the public programs, more public facing programs along to that side. So looking at where the library would be located, weight room, locker rooms, and the gymnasium. And then just kind of giving an overview of what the site would look like there with the new proposed building footprint. Also, one of the priority items that we were looking at is maybe relocating the bus garage down the road and that opening up space for a new playground on the north of the site. And then these are a couple of concept images that we had pulled together that would look like.
I know that some of the folks here have seen a lot of this, been a part of this process in different degrees, and some folks might not be as familiar with all of these things, so I just wanna make sure that it's all, and I know we've got some more stuff to talk about, so maybe we can come back to, talking about those priorities and the things we heard and kinda how we got here more, if folks wanna do that, and kinda what's happening here, and I don't even wanna make sure people are oriented properly with what they're seeing here and where they're looking to.
So we started looking at the priorities and thinking about it in phases. So this one on the screen is a combined phase 1 and 2. So hitting those initial priority items, those 5 items that we had mentioned earlier in the slides, as well as starting to maybe touch on some of the other priority items that rose to the top from user group feedback and the surveys. So again, looking at that front entrance, and starting to address the admin areas, locker rooms, restrooms, and then in this example also showing the old section of the school gone and replaced with a new piece. And then this is a breakdown of the costs next to the phase, so you can kind of see those items and how they're pulled out, and then the totals there. Tom, if you want to expand on any of this necessarily, but
Well, yeah, so,
Which town?
yeah.
either one.
You'll notice on phase 1, and maybe just tell them what's in phase 1, and then I'll talk about the
Yep.
money part.
Yep.
Here, you can steer this if you wanna go back and forth.
So phase 1, looking at the items, locker rooms, there's 4 of them that are being addressed on the first floor. Demoing the 1914 building structure over here. And then needing to find a space for some additional classrooms that were located in the oldest section of the school. So that is an item on there. Addressing any sound transfer issues between classrooms. And then the other items on there is the addition of the admin first floor, the addition of classrooms, and any stairs in circulation.
Maybe explain too that on the far left there, that's actually the second
Oh,
story.
yes, sorry. Yep, I should mention that. This is kind of pulled off to the side. It's actually the second story above this admin piece. So that would connect to the existing second floor of the school. And then moving into phase 2.
Does that phase 1, does that incorporate with the tear off of the old building to the north? Does that include the passageway of the tic-tac-toe mentality that you had talked about initially, and can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, can I elaborate a little, Becca? So, we had a series of priorities that Becca mentioned that, were obviously hot button issues that you wanted to address. And then as we wanted to make sure that what we find is critical is that we don't correct some problems and create more problems long term. And what we call you refer to the tic-tac-toe, and some of you that were part of that earlier conversations is really what we find is it's just hypercritical to create circulation routes and keep circulation routes open for the future. And these are super conducive to being they're smart long-term planning for school districts as you continue to add and expand. If you keep your corridors clean, obviously there's security, there's some basic amenities, but from structurally adding on to buildings, both the foundation and underpinning foundations, from roof loads and snow loads. There is a safety and security aspect of being able to look down the corridors, and there is also there's ADA when you're starting to build on the same level. You avoid a lot of other issues that happen over time in some school districts. So we call it this tic-tac-toe. And really it is if you can keep a series of circulation routes clear as you do any renovations over the period of a school district, it will in the long run save you money and be more effective for your school. So as we talk about replacing that 1914, we'll call it the original building, although it was an addition, but that building, which has its own problems, certainly in ADA, certainly with remediation needs, a lot of things going on in that building, and it was a very small footprint. But keeping in mind that we want to have a circulation route through there. A new addition that really connects both sides of the campus, gives a public facing to one side that would have the new gym is up here, as well as what we're proposing for this public library, private public library for the school and community, the commons that gets a multi-use space. Really works really well, but we would be able to address things like what you originally discussed, the lockers. Okay, let's renovate those and have those accessible to that primary corridor. Now we've got the 4 locker rooms that will be able to address double headers and things like that. It's in a really great location. The location it's in, we are flipping it onto this main corridor, so it'll open up closer to the new gym. But that tic-tac-toe thing specifically that you're mentioning, you do see it there. And right now you have a lot of strange things happening at the school. It is not, you walk through the old gym, right, while there's things going on through there, whether they're having lunch stuff or whether they're having PE or whatever's going on. That's a primary access point now. By doing this, we're moving circulation around and throughout it, so there will be some efficiencies to that, but also it will make more sense is our hope. So that's some of the issues you're seeing right here, and I think what we've tried to do is look at these different phases and say, okay, how can we get the high priority items per phase? But we also want to do them within some sort of strategic way to potentially pay for them. And Tom Oster will talk a little bit more about those as well. But that's where we look at, okay, locker rooms in phase 1. We know that's a priority. We know we can address it. And actually, no matter what happens, we know that what we're going to do with the locker rooms is not going to impact some other future thing. It's going to work into a longer plan and not be a problem you're going to need to fix in 10 or 20 years later on, because we didn't really think through those issues. The demo of the 1914 building, that wasn't necessarily the first priority we came here for, but when we started to do the surveys, talk to faculty, staff, community members, it became apparent that that building is not functioning very well. So we've added that priority here, and it partly phases into kind of how you would do this, how we would structure it, what makes the most sense to do it. So we've kind of put some of these in the right category depending on what just sort of makes sense both financially, phasing wise as we do this, which will be a little bit of a challenge. So you see the 1914 building, the classrooms that we would be taking out need to come back into this project. So we show those could connect on the second floor of that of your other 60s edition. And what we're trying to do when you see the 60s, it's 60.
Yeah.
No,
It's
so
a spot.
no, I'm just saying the 1914 building's on the north side. Oh,
Yeah.
north, up where the Commons is, right?
No, actually the 19, it's.
Oh, no, yeah, I'm
we
turning
could've-
around. You're right.
We
I'm
probably
sorry.
could have, I don't know, I don't think we have, what you're seeing here in this portion is existing. We're showing new windows in there. But that's your existing building, 1960s portion. Attached to it, there's kind of your link and entry point, and then there's the 1914 edition that's actually in this portion. So it's just, we're taking the best sort of architectural elements of what we think the school has and expanding them and creating a really nice entry for this edition. So the commons and library portion would be up here on the corner, your entry that cuts all the way through right here, and then a 2-story space that would have both admin and then classrooms up above it and be a part of that corridor. Let me go back. So you were looking at that entryway right here. Two-story library and 2-story common space would have been up here, and then the 2-story where that old 1914 building was right here, and it's now replaced with a building that more or less matches your 1914 sense. Yeah. So your entry is, you know, pretty close to where it is. We've shifted it up just a little bit. So it'll be on the north, you know, just between the two gyms, basically.
So, can you go back to the one that showed phase two?
Yeah, I don't know how well those show up.
So we're, in this, the entrance would remain as is then? The main entrance? Cause
Well-
I see that's in phase two.
Yeah, you're right. No, the new entrance is phase two, really. And Becca, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because we'd have sort of a temporary solution here.
Yep, exactly. So in this combination, on the floor plans, you're seeing the phase one and two combined. So we're kind of thinking about this as like your first steps. What would be like the initial moves you would make, in this master plan process? And then in phase three, which we'll jump to in a little bit, would be the next steps after that. So we're showing these combined at the moment, just to kind of get the bigger picture, across to the group. So you can see some of the priority items are kind of spread between, the phases there.
It's a great question though, because we would want to be real clear about where you're going to enter the building in phase one, or if you only did phase one, how you're going to enter the building, potentially. So we need to clearly articulate how phase one works, should that be the only phase that gets completed, because this is combined.
Yeah, if the board decides to just do phase one, then you're gonna see a different drawing that would address entry and all that, because you wouldn't be doing phase two. And when I get into the financing of this, it'll be more clear too about what happens if you do phase one only versus phases one and two.
Okay, so, and in phase one, what we were talking about, you have the locker rooms, demo of the 1914 building, the classrooms that would get built, and then the sound transfer in the classrooms, addressing some of those, which we have in the 60s building. Addition of the administrative first floor, addition of the 3 classrooms on second floor, so those are replacing the 1914 addition. And then we would have a stair and circulation tower that would have to be included in that as well, which is kind of a part of that. So it would really be right through there, getting done with that, as well as the locker rooms, all of those components. But the phase two portion, and Becca, I'm stepping on your toes, all right. The restroom renovations of first and second floor, which we know those are a priority. How we phase it, from a price point, we think they work better in phase two, but that's something that can be discussed. The new front entrance then is actually part of phase two of this part, and the new commons, the new library, community library, and also school library, the kitchen and concessions. We would propose adding a new kitchen concessions, storage and mechanical. We would add the elevator then at this point, an additional elevator. You have one elevator in the back. And there would be this, of course, circulation corridor, some additional restrooms in the commons vicinity, and then weight room would need some work, some renovation work where we're proposing it being moved, as well as some bus garage improvements and playground improvements throughout. So that really moves. Those are the phase two portions of this. So in a sense, you know, there's,
I have one question. This doesn't, either phase one or phase two, there's nothing that will be done in our technically old gym. That'll just stay as is. There's nothing.
do you wanna address that, Becca?
Yeah, well, so we do know there's like acoustic issues with some of the classroom spaces around, and we also heard that with the old gymnasium too. And so aside from, you know, some of the sound issues, I'm not sure if we heard any other ones aside from that.
The you know, the storage, was an issue that we've looked at and have several iterations of how to maybe even eliminating some of these old seats in there as well, besides the acoustic issue, right? these phases right now, in these two phases. I do think that, yeah, I mean, if those priorities came to the front, you know, those aren't huge ticket items, but certainly I think both of them are.
Matt, were you thinking, were you wondering like about seating or?
Making it more of an auxiliary gym versus, you know, an old gym, you know, maybe giving it a facelift. is all.
Yeah.
I'm not as.
Cosmetics.
Yeah, just a facelift is
Yep.
all I'm asking, but it's not, it was just a question I asked,
Sure.
I'm not.
The good news about, I mean, this wouldn't give it the facelift you're talking about, but if you move commons, basically all of your lunch functions out of there,
Yeah.
and you move circulation out of there, I do think that you'd get more functionality out of it as an auxiliary gym. It'd be able to be dedicated mostly towards auxiliary gym purposes. That should let you steer.
We can go back.
Am I going the wrong way?
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, and then phase 3 would be looking at what we were showing on that site plan earlier. So down the road, in the future, thinking about, you know, if that, BOAG and bus shop go away, seeing those spaces be reconnected to the school, really looking at, you know, how that can connect to the circulation and thinking about some of those adjacencies as well. And so you're seeing on the east side here, the BOAG shop reconnected, and then, you know, that working with the music room as well. There'd have to be a little bit of modification there, but you can start to see that you get this really clean, circulation through the school, and that hits at some of the points that, Tom was talking about earlier with the tic-tac-toe diagram. And so in phase 3, you're kind of seeing all of the priority items played out.
Yeah, it's a really clean plan. I think getting back to that, you know, your BOAG is a popular area that I think gets well used and is successful. You know, obviously the bus barn, where you park your buses is way too small and super challenging, and problematic. That building is a 1970 building, so it will have there will be a day where it's not functioning very well. And to be totally honest, it is not necessarily the most aesthetic entrance to your school. Quite honestly, it looks like you show up to a metal building when you get here, and I think that there's opportunities when that day comes, and I think this is lower on your priority, thus the phase 3. But when the life of that comes and you can relocate that bus barn to another spot on your campus, it could be an opportunity to, again, create a really beautiful school. And one thing we heard a lot about when we were going through this is this is a thing that is important to a lot of your students, is pride in your school. And we heard that through and through when we were doing this. Is people they love their community, but they don't have pride in the physical building. And so these kind of moves also are a part of that as well, if that makes sense.
And then just to add to that too, you would get also a connected playground to the school, which is another item that we heard a lot during some of the user group meetings, is just really wanting a playground that's right next to the school for the safety factor, and then also just creating a really great space. I think right now you kind of have 3 different playgrounds that the kids kind of disperse to, so creating one really nice playground on site.
And particularly, you could also, this would be relocating a lot of those little tomatoes would be able to come off of that hallway or commons area and be on campus as they are now, but in a much more sort of enjoyable kind of environment there that would also, I think, be a, you know, you could make a nice playground there that would look good. The BOAG works really, I mean, there's a lot of things on here that I think work really well. We work with a lot of school districts, and your situation is not unique in that there's been additions over, you know, 5 or 6 additions over 100 years. It's not unique, but yours actually allows for many of the right functions to be in the right places, many of the right circulation to go where it should be. Some of these things can't quite as easily be corrected on other schools, so it really could create a great front door, great circulation, great functions throughout the school, challenge is determining whether or not you have the appetite and you have the ability to do this, and that's up to you, that's something you folks would have to talk about. But it could set you up, for the next 50 years.
And then, yep, what you're seeing now is just those phase 3 items, which we kind of already hit. Connection with the egg shop, some circulation through the stairs, that would be reworked with this phase, the new bus garage, demoing the 1975 shop building, and then any parking
That's
site improvements.
Those are some placeholders, some dollars in there for fixing up some parking issues, some things that need to be, there's a lot more conversations that need to happen in terms of working out some details with some of these other placeholder items. Even the shop building, we're not necessarily locating it. You do own a decent, handful of properties around the school that could be conducive for those kind of things.
And then this was a kind of an alternate plan too, so phase 3 again.
We could dive more into the details of that. Quite honestly, a few of those pieces can still move. I think the key here is understanding that we have a budget and a program that can work, and then I think we would need to work with your leadership and a lot of you folks on dialing down some details. We're happy to talk more about them now. I really like the plan that Becca's got working here. But Tom can, we're showing some, this is more than a locker room renovation, and so, it would only be fair to say, well, how the heck would you even approach it if you were going to?
Yeah, so this is kind of the point where we're at. Do you have the,
Yep, which document do you want me to?
this one?
Okay.
I have to stand, I can't sit there. So, at this point, you kind of know there's everything, what I call on the wish list in phases 1, 2, and 3. And they're kind of prioritized based on all the input that Becca and Tom took when they met with your folks. Phase 1 are kind of the most important things, phase 2, and then of course you know that you can't get to this project if you don't do this project, and everything has to work functionally while you're going through it. So that's why it's broken down into those phases. And then we broke it down further because everybody wants to know, what are we getting and how are we gonna pay for it and what's it gonna cost me? And so that's kind of what this part here is. The most important thing for a school district is the amount of assessed valuation you have in your district. And you have a nice sized assessed valuation relative to the number of kids that you serve. So you have 278 million in assessed valuation. The reason that's important is that dictates your taxes. And so the bigger it is, relative to the amount of kids that you serve, the better. By law, the board can borrow 4.18 million in capital outlay certificates. It's not subject to a vote. Even if the board wanted to take it to a vote, it's illegal. You cannot ask the public for a vote if you borrow capital outlay certificates. This has been that way for 75 years. The legislature put this in a long time ago because they wanted school boards across the state to have the ability to borrow a limited amount of money for projects without it being subject to a vote. Otherwise, the concern is that there are some school districts that could never spend any money because people would never vote for it. And so that's why that law is the way it is. So the board has the ability, and by the way, that borrowing of that money does not raise taxes. It absolutely does not raise taxes. The payments on that borrowing of that money has to come from their existing capital outlay funds. It also does not affect teacher salaries or anything like that. We get into all this all the time, and I'll go into more detail if you have a public meeting if the board decides to move forward. But it's capital outlay money which cannot be used for paying teacher salaries. And so that's important to know. The annual payments, and you'll notice I have dates on here, because if you've all watched the news, you know interest rates are, like this. And so as of July 27th, that's what this information is from. So the annual payments on that capital outlay certificate borrowing, that 4.18 million, would be $315,000 annually. And again, that money comes out of your existing capital outlay budget, which you have the wherewithal to do. You are currently allowed a maximum of $700,000 in capital outlay. Now, I just heard this evening that your student enrollment is up. That capital outlay revenue is dictated by the number of students you have. So the more students you have, the more capital outlay revenue you have access to. You're currently transferring $315,000 from capital outlay to the general fund. And I say currently, I'm talking about the 22-23 school year. I don't have any idea what the 23-24 school year, what that number will look like. But if your enrollment is up, that number is likely coming down, the amount of transfer. Net capital outlay left to work with, $385,000. Net capital outlay budget after the certificate payment would be $70,000. That's not enough. That's not enough to function, and so you'll notice my note there, need to reduce this, transferring from capital outlay to the general fund, which, if your enrollment is up, will make that much easier to do. Okay? So, and I use round numbers, the maximum amount the district can borrow from capital outlay certificates would be $4 million. Let's go to the next page, please. Actually, that'll work. So, financing for options phase 1 and phase 2. If you remember, when Becca was showing phase 1 and phase 2, the total cost of those two phases was $11.5 million. Okay, how would we come up with $11.5 million? You currently have surplus cash in your capital outlay fund, roughly $1.9 million. You don't want to spend all of that money because you need a certain amount of capital outlay on hand in case a boiler blows up, a bus dies, whatever the case might be. But you could easily spend $1.5 million of that surplus towards this project. Then you borrow those capital outlay certificates that I referred to, and again, I just use round numbers, 4 million, I didn't put 4,180,000 there. And then you would need to pass a GO bond of $6 million. That would get you to 11.5 and would allow the school district to complete phases 1 and phase 2. What if we pass a GO bond? Now that is voted on by the taxpayers. The board doesn't even have a choice on that. If you ask for a GO bond, it goes immediately to the taxpayers for a vote. And it needs a supermajority to pass. It cannot pass with 50%, it has to have 60% in order to pass. So what does a $6 million bond look like for the taxpayers of the Marion School District? Okay, well, I'll come back to this. So let's go to, I'll look at my own sheet. And my glasses. Thank you. I apologize here. I'm kind of going back and forth. So on a GO bond of $6 million, it would raise taxes by $1.36 per thousand. So what does that mean? If a house is assessed at $100,000 here in Marion, the tax increase would be $136. If it's assessed at $200,000, it would be double that. But like most of our small schools, the majority of your tax base is ag land. And that's what we need to talk about, is the ag land. So a quarter of ag land assessed at $300,000. And people get confused on this right away. I'm sure that there is ag land that's selling in the Marion School District for $10,000 or more per acre. Is that accurate? Anybody heard of a land sale? Yeah. However, that land is actually assessed at more like $1,800 to $2,000 an acre. it's not assessed at market value. It has a taxable value on it, and what we've found is that an average quarter of land could be assessed at around $300,000. So what does that mean for a quarter of land that's assessed at $300,000? Would see a tax increase of $409 or $2.56 an acre. So about a third of a bushel of corn is what the taxes would increase on ag land. And then again, a home value at $100,000, and again, it's assessed value. So the house might be worth $150,000, but the county auditor and the director of equalization might have it assessed at $100,000. And that's what this is working off of, is what the taxable value is, not the market value. So to pass a bond, again, backing up, a $6 million bond would have a tax increase of $1.36 per thousand based on the taxable value of the property, not the actual value. So why did we break it down like that, a $6 million bond? Because if you did phase one, that was roughly $5.5 million. And that's why the architects built that in there. I told them that number. I said, if they are adamant, if the board is adamant that we're not gonna try and pass a bond, then you only have $5.5 million to work with. So phase one cannot exceed $5.5 million. And that's what they put into that phase based on the priorities they heard from you and what you can afford and the sequence in which things have to happen to make this work, okay? Well, let's say the board decides, yeah, let's try this. I mean, the taxpayers get to decide, let's try it, and let's say that it passes, okay? Now you can do phases one and phase two, but you can't afford to do phase three. Now, you could, that number, we could change that $6 million bond to $8.5 million, and then you could do all three phases. My fear is the higher that tax increase though, the bigger chance that that bond may fail. So is it better then to wait and then see what your enrollment does? If your enrollment continues to increase like it is, then you could look at another round of capital outlay certificates for phase three. And then you wouldn't even need that in a bond. You could pay for it from within your existing budget. You couldn't do that immediately. You'd have to wait to see what your enrollment did. Now let's say that you got 5 years down the road and your enrollment didn't grow beyond what it is this fall, and you wanted to finish phase three. Well, then you could ask for another bond vote. And of course, the tax increase on 2.5 million would be far less than what it is on the 6 million. And let the public decide at that point if they feel like the school district needs phase three. So we will do whatever you want. If you want the architects to just say, you know what, we're just gonna look at phase one. Or we're gonna do phase one, but we wanna include parts of phase two. Whatever you wanna do, we just gave you some scenarios. And we thought it makes sense to tell you what it would cost if you decided to do all of phase one and phase two. But you could honestly do any combination of those. However, keep in mind that those things have to be sequenced. You can't do something that includes where the 1914 building is if that's not been replaced or demolished and removed, obviously. So things have to happen in a certain sequence, but we'll do it however you want. But we thought there's no sense in going any further than this until you guys get to see this and then give us some direction back on what are your thoughts, where do you want to go from here, what does this look like? Does the bond need to be 6 million? Only if you include all of the items in phase one and phase two. If you eliminate some of those, then the bond could be less. If you want to try and do all three phases at once, the bond would need to be 8.5 million, and then I could give you some numbers on that. you know, just roughly off the top of my head, it would increase, the tax increase by about a third. Because you'd be going from 6 million to 8.5 million. And so that $1.36 would be, pardon me? About $2, yeah. And, you know, you don't have any conception of what that's like because you've not passed a bond, but Tri-Valley, for instance, they passed a bond. Their bond tax increase was over $3 a thousand. That is high. I mean, from what we see, normally that's high, but somehow they passed that there. DeSmit passed a $9 million bond. It raised their taxes about $1.10. Willow Lake passed a $9 million bond, and theirs went up about $1.05. But theirs was actually about $1.50, which would have been higher than yours. But because they had this huge influx of kids, they were able to use less capital outlay for something else, and they did some capital outlay certificates. So it just varies. By the way, both DeSmit and Willow Lake have huge assessed valuations. And so the tax increase is lower in those situations, even though they borrowed more money than you're talking about borrowing. So I looked at it and said, you know, what's reasonable, what could pass? I mean, sure, we'd all like to say, well, let's do the whole phase 1, 2, and 3 and do an $8.5 million bond, but it doesn't do any good if we can't pass it and if the public is not in favor of it. Questions on the finance?
I have one question. If we did phase 1 and 2 and then put like on phase 3 on a 5 or 10 year plan, these current prices are at what they would be if we built now. In 5 to 10 years, in your experience, does that cost go up, stay the same, or go down? If we're only adding 2 million something for phase 3, but in 10 years, we're looking at that's now a $3.5 to $4 million to do phase 3. Are we cost effective to do it now compared to later?
So 2 answers to that. Historically, you know, interest rates, it wasn't that long ago when schools were borrowing money at 1.8% interest. Today, they're borrowing it at 4.25%. Now, when you see that and hear that, you're like, holy cow, that's a huge difference. And it is. However, historically, 4.25% is still really low. I mean, if you look back 75 or 100 years, the average interest rate, 2, is just unheard of. And so, but we're hearing that by the time you might need this money and this thing would be ready to go and a bond would pass, we're hearing that by the first quarter of 24, they're thinking interest rates are going to start declining. So that could be to your advantage. 5 years from now, Tom can speak to this better than I can, but I know this. You can figure 5% increase on a building project every year like clockwork, except the last 3, where inflation was just crazy. As you all know, I'm sure you hear about it in the grocery store, or you hear about it in the grocery store. You don't hear about it in the grocery store. You feel it in the grocery store. So yeah, there were 30% increases, you know, 2 or 3 years, or for about 2 or 3 years. But I think Tom would tell you that typically 5-6% every year. So if you waited 5 years, it could be 25% higher. Is that?
No, exactly right. I mean, we always, this question comes up at every single meeting, and the answer is, the best time to build is yesterday, and the next best time is today, and tomorrow will be more expensive. But Tom is right. Historically, you know, 5% we would say we'd be safe. We had runaway inflation for about 12 to 18 months where nobody could figure out what it was costing. It cost more than double what it cost to build a school 4 years ago. What's it going to be in another 4 years? I can't say, but I do know that the Sioux Falls market, and I include this in there because the contractors from that area would be interested here, have you know, we have discussed that it is now stabilizing again, and we're hoping that we're back on a normal path where we can actually estimate a material, you know, everything is in a stabilization mood again. I can't promise anything, but it's feeling better for the first time where we can actually try to estimate with a level of accuracy.
You'd be
So-
surprised the difference in being able to get competitive bids, even from Willow Lake to DeSmit. Because contractors are so busy that they only bid on the projects they want, or that are, where their contractors can drive out from Sioux Falls or drive back, or drive out from Watertown and drive back, or, wherever they're coming from. But as Tom said, things are slowing, and so that's actually good timing for you. I think interest rates also could be good timing for you, where they might be coming down. These are based on those rates that I'm talking about today, but we're working with, a handful of other schools that are looking at borrowing money too. And I just got off a conference call today with West Lyon, Iowa, right across the border, and they work with Piper Jaffray out of Des Moines, and he told them the same thing. By the time they need to borrow the money, he thinks interest rates will be lower than they are today, which, could be a good thing. To your point, yeah, and it's gonna be more expensive. I can't think of anything that's gotten cheaper with the exception of maybe technology. You can buy a big screen TV a lot cheaper than you could 15 years ago, but that's about it.
Are these numbers inflated at all to match today's market, or are they based on, 3 years ago or 2 years ago?
No, these, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Tom. No, these are what we would see, and then we're kind of projecting out in the next 6 months or year. There's a little bit in there, but no, we don't. They're certainly not 3 years ago. I mean, if it were 3 years ago, you might see $175, $180 for new construction. You're seeing over $400, $475 in some instances, depending on what we're building. So, it depends on the areas, but you're seeing numbers now that go from 3 to 475.
Check this line right here. Design contingency, 10%. That's partly in there to make up for, what if we missed the pricing, what if steel spiked right when we went to bids? Now, part of that is because there are other design things that come in. The other thing we find, show the bottom number there, the 11, there you go. So 11,510,000, that's their projection as of today, okay, for the total project. What we find almost every time we do a project like this, we're gonna get 4 months down the road, and you guys are gonna get input from folks, and they're gonna say, we want X. And you're gonna come to the architects and say, you need to add X. And then that number is gonna be 11,700,000, and somebody's gonna say, well, that's more than you said it was. Well, that isn't because what happened with us. That's because you guys changed the plan, but nobody ever remembers that. And so keep that in mind. But yeah, that is the best estimate they can come up with as of today's prices.
We look at a lot of other projects that are going on right now and try to interpolate with those. And Tom said, we carry a 10% design contingency specifically for, we don't know if there is an excess in escalation or what it might be. We need to carry that at this point. And if you look between the two phases, 442 and 488, it's almost $1 million in contingency dollars, because this is not an exact science. It depends on market conditions and what's happening. And so we need to carry some money. Hopefully we're inside of that. We also carry construction reserve too. So those are additional items that, we know you're gonna have some things that we haven't discussed yet because we haven't dove deep, and we're gonna have to add a few things. And it doesn't work to go back and ask for another $1 million on the bond vote when you do it. It's a one-shot deal. We gotta get the right amount in there.
Well, and Matt, perfect example is the gym, the auxiliary gym, the WPA gym. Let's say that you guys were like, that thing needs a facelift. Maybe it's paint, maybe it's some acoustics, whatever. Well, that's why some of that is in there. It can handle some of those minor changes. Now, if you start adding, 5,000 square feet, that number's gonna change dramatically. The other thing to keep in mind is, this is your money. So if the architects don't use that and the bids don't use that, that's your money. You don't spend that. And my recommendation would be, you spend your cash last. Your surplus cash that you're going to put into this project, because you have to borrow the capital outlay certificates, and if the bond passes, you have to borrow that. You don't have a choice on that once you make that commitment. So that would be 10 million of the 11.5. The other 1.5 is your surplus cash. Well, let's say the bids come in great and they don't need all the design contingency, and it's 300,000 less than you thought. Well, instead of spending 1.5 of your cash, you spend 1.2. Or, yeah, 1.2. And so now you've got an extra 300,000 in cash on hand, which is never a bad thing.
So what's the difference between contingency and construction reserve?
Yeah, well, you know, so it's a great question, but design contingency is specifically a more broad category. We see construction as like, when it's construction reserve, like there's gonna be some unforeseen things in a project like this that we know there's some unknowns in a building like this. I mean, you've got some old buildings, we're gonna be, you know, taking down a 1914 building. There's no possible way when we demo it, we're gonna find there's an oil tank down there. Or there will be something, the soil will be unstable, something will happen. Construction reserve is specific to construction issues, but more broadly, design contingency is the things that are not, like if you wanted to add something that we just hadn't got to, or if you wanted to have an escalation, like a cost escalation number. Construction is really based on a construction issue that comes up that we could not have planned for, that is in an existing condition. They're related, right? But we typically, that's how I would do it. Design is more broad. We don't know. I mean, that's just.
Well, Tom, isn't it fair to say that the closer you get to going to bids, you start to reduce those numbers?
For sure, absolutely. When we do this process, as we would go, we would continue to reduce that, and typically, the construction reserve we would keep until we would keep that through construction because we don't know what we're gonna find. But the design contingency would come all the way down, and really it could come very close to zero as we get to bid day. We figure out what to do with that money. I mean, once we decide what we're doing and not doing, you know, that money can go away. But we need it right now because we don't know. There's just too many variables.
So construction reserve would be for like structures and soils, stuff like that?
Yep, absolutely.
Asbestos.
Yep.
You know, just when you tear into the side of a building where they're
Yep.
connected, you just don't know exactly what's gonna happen. Maybe when you tear that 1914 building down, something came down that wasn't supposed to, you know, just unforeseen, where you couldn't, acts of God type of thing.
Right.
I mean, Tom's right. These numbers are gonna move a little bit. We don't have, contractor hasn't bid on them, but we will carry a construction reserve to the very end of the project. It will go down once the project actually starts, right? But, we get, close to the end, that would get released and you guys would get whatever's in their back.
Worst case scenario is, let's say that you borrowed the 4 million in capital outlay certificates and the public said yes to your bond and you had 6 million there and you had the 1.5 in cash. Those we know, so now we got 11.5 million. But if they didn't have any flexibility in here, and all of a sudden we go to bid and it comes in at 12.3, we got a problem. Because there's no getting more money in your situation. And by the way, that 11.5 million, that's all in everything. That's the architect fees, the engineer fees, the soil borings. It's not just the construction. The construction part of this is far less than the total cost of the project. And you only pay the architect fees on the cost of construction. It's not based on the whole project.
A caveat, thank you, Tom, because it is important to know, is there's a note that Becca has at the bottom. This does not include furniture, fixtures and equipment, FF&E items. And so those in particular, would be be something that we'd wanna think about and budget for. Now, maybe we can, you know, as this goes, maybe there's some design contingency dollars that can be allocated towards it, right? That could be a thing to use. But that would be something that we need to think about, and part of that is because we haven't discussed with you kind of the condition of the furniture that you have now, for example. We love to put new furniture in a new building though. I mean, there's nothing less fun than putting 50-year-old furniture in a really nice space, so.
The best way our colleague Kyle explains this is that when the building's all built and you pick it up and shake it, anything that falls out of the building is not included. That's furniture, fixtures, and equipment.
Yeah.
If it sticks, like casework, that sticks. So that is included. Stuff like that is included. But the portable whiteboard would not be. So that gives you a good idea. Desks is the main, and chairs.
Portable whiteboard, no. This whiteboard would be included. I mean, it's really that's how we approach it. That's the right way to do it. It's an odd thing and we worked through all that with you. Make sure you know exactly what's included, what's going on.
These guys don't tout this as much as I think we should, but if the board moves forward with this and the public votes for this, when you get into the design, we have this virtual thing where we would take your staff members, and let's say that there was this room that we were building. The staff members will look at that and will say, now here's where we have this whiteboard. And the teacher might say, I don't think that's where it goes, it should go over here. Well, then we can move that. We talk about where the outlets are and how many outlets there are. A good example when we were doing the Elkton School was they had put a new staff room in. And we asked them if they wanted water stubbed in for a refrigerator in case they ever had water and ice in the refrigerator. And the superintendent, who's a good friend of ours, he's like, no, we don't need that, we don't need that. And I said, okay, Brian, I get that, but just keep in mind, it's $20 to put it in at this point, but if you have to add it 3 or 4 or 5 years from now, it could be $1,500. Oh, okay, let's put it in. We didn't put water in, add a refrigerator, but stubbed it in. Little things like that, so when you get in the building, you got what you thought you were getting. So the windows on the east side will all be new? Yeah. How about the south side? Are they included?
We wanna do windows throughout,
Yeah.
south and east side, or south. Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know that, but when I got here early tonight and drove around like 3 times around the facility, and you've done what countless schools have done to save utilities. We had these leaky old windows, and so then they put the particle board in there and then put a small window in. Well, now the windows are so much better, triple pane glass and all of that. You can actually put back the entire window like it used to be when they built the thing. But if you notice on the south side of the building, a lot of those particle boards or whatever that material is, they're starting to bubble and crack from the sun beating on it. So I'm glad to hear that it includes windows.
Anything else? Anyone got any questions? If not, we'd like to thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Great presentation.
And honestly, at this point, I think the ball's in your guys' court. You gotta kind of give us direction on A, do you wanna move forward? And B, if you do wanna move forward, do you want it to be phase 1, phase 2, some combination thereof? Or phase 1, 2, and 3? I mean, that's a board decision.
Thank you very much.
The floor plan, is that obviously adjustable?
Absolutely. The master plan, we need to get a rough idea of the square foot, a rough idea of how much renovation. But but there's a lot of room to maneuver things at this point. You know, it doesn't cost anything for a lot of these moves to move some spaces around and say, you know what, actually this classroom would be better over there. Maybe we need this, the kitchen isn't quite the right spot, but we have a space allocated for the kitchen and a dollar amount allocated. So, we'd love it, you know, master planning is not the final plan.
It's hard to, if you don't put it out there though, draw something up, it's hard to even conceptualize what.
Anything else? If not, then we'll move for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion by Jared, is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Amalia.
I'm here.
All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, motion carries.